This is a post in one of the Facebook Bible groups that caught my attention the other day. It asked, why does the NIV get so much hate? And that is definitely a good question. It's something that I have definitely noticed, and maybe you've noticed, that the New International Version Bible translation gets a lot of criticism thrown toward it. And it's really fascinating to ask, why does that happen? There's a lot of other translations. Why aren't they criticized as much as the NIV? Now, I don't know if it actually gets the most criticism, but it does seem to me that that is true. And I thought it was a great question, and so I want to look at that in this video and talk about what I would give as the top 5 reasons why the NIV is criticized so much. Now, I do want to say, from my perspective, I think the NIV is actually a really good translation. There are a lot of good things about it, and I think it's a translation that is a good translation to use. It's not necessarily my number one translation, but I think it is a really good translation. But that being said, I do want to look at these 5 reasons why people criticize the NIV. The first is the timing of the NIV. The New International Version was first completed, the entire Bible, in 1978. And during this time period, there were a lot of Bible translations that had the word new in front of the translations, like the New American Standard Bible or the New King James Version, and in 1989, the New Revised Standard Version. And really, these Bibles are just updating existing translations, and they're saying we're going to take these historic translations and we're going to put them in more up-to-date English for the modern reader. The New International Version was part of that trend, really, of having a modern English translation, but it wasn't updating an existing translation. It was a completely fresh translation from the original languages. So the New International Version kind of stood out as being this really fresh translation, new translation with good scholarship behind it, and still very understandable and readable for modern readers. And so it really was on top of a trend that was already taking place during the 60s and 70s of having updated English translations using wording that modern people can actually understand. There was a really high demand for that, and the New International Version came on the scene right at the right time. Also, along with that, the King James Version, I would say, was starting to lose its status as being the Bible that everybody used all the time as their go-to Bible translation in the English-speaking world. There was now the possibility of the King James Version actually being supplanted as the number one Bible, and that is when the NIV came on the scene. That leads to the second thing that is the basis for a lot of criticism of the NIV, and that is its success. The NIV has been an incredibly successful translation since it came on the scene. It has been sold very widely and used very widely in churches, and I think this is true not only in a country like the United States, but in English-speaking countries around the world. It was marketed as the New International Version, which was a very smart move because they really were trying to appeal broadly to English speakers around the world. And there are even New International Versions in other languages as well. So it really is trying to be an international enterprise, a very broadly appealing translation, and I think it was marketed very well, and it's written in very clear, readable English. So it became a very successful translation. If you look at the charts for Bible sales, the NIV is often at the top of the charts, even outselling the King James Version. So when you look at these first 2 reasons, you can see that the NIV is really a translation that is outperforming the King James Version and kind of supplanting the King James Version in use in the English-speaking world. And I think that drew a lot of criticism from the beginning for the New International Version. Now, the third reason for criticism that I'm going to give here has to do with its translation philosophy, which does contrast with the King James Version, which is a quite literal translation of the original languages. Even supplied words in English in a lot of King James Bibles are in italics. The New International Version isn't a super literal translation. However, it's not a paraphrase either. It's more middle of the road in its approach. So it's a Bible translation that people could say is actually scholarly and accurate, and yet it's still very readable and written in very good English, the kind of English that we use today. So because it's kind of middle of the road in its approach, on one hand, that makes it very usable and accessible, and people like it when they read it. On the other hand, there are people who think a translation needs to be very literal, and because it's not highly literal, they criticize it. Again, this does tie back into some of the King James ideology, but also other Christians who just think you need to have a very literal translation for it to be accurate. So that's another reason that it's criticized, is because of its translation philosophy. It is more of a dynamic equivalence than just a purely formal equivalent type of translation. A fourth criticism of the NIV, and this is something that you will hear quite a bit from certain circles, is its textual basis. Now again, the NIV really wasn't the first modern translation to use a different textual basis than the King James Version, which used the 1500s Textus Receptus, whereas modern translations, even dating back to something like the American Standard Version of 1901, used a more recent critical text than the Textus Receptus. But the NIV does use a different textual basis than some people would hold to. People that use the King James, or people that are just more used to some of the renderings of the King James Version, might not understand why the New International Version is a bit different in certain places. So that is another basis of criticism for the New International Version, is its textual basis for the New Testament. Now, whether that criticism is founded or not, that's something that you really have to look into, research, and understand all of the factors. That's something I have talked about a bit on this channel before. Finally, the fifth criticism that I'm going to talk about here of the NIV is its 2011 update. The New International Version was already a version that tended to be criticized even early on for the reasons that I've talked about, but then in 2011 it was updated and it used a more gender-neutral approach to translation, and so that garnered a lot of criticism, particularly from the most conservative circles of Christianity who felt that the NIV was caving in to certain cultural trends. But one thing you do have to understand is that the NIV has always been more focused on how do people speak today in modern English. They're really trying to take the Bible translation and make sure it speaks to an everyday, average, modern reader. And if you pay attention to how people actually talk today, they don't use masculine language as much as they used to. So when we're talking about a hypothetical person, it is very common for us to say, I was talking to someone the other day and they said to me. And so we use this plural form, they, to refer to one person in a generic sense. We're trying to say it is a person, but we're not trying to specify whether it's a man or a woman. And so we use that generic plural form, even though we're talking about one person. The NIV 2011 started to adopt this practice in the way that they rendered certain phrases. And while it is not like the original language, the NIV is actually reflecting how English is used more and more today. And again, this has to do a lot with translation philosophy and what you're focusing on. Are you focused a lot more on the original language wording, or are you also focused a lot on the way that we read and write today? So in looking at these 5 different criticisms, the thing I would honestly say is that the New International Version is not really that much different than a lot of other modern Bible translations. It just happened to come on the scene at a pivotal point in time in Bible translation history in the English-speaking world, and it was highly successful. And anytime something is highly successful, it's more likely to be highly praised as well as highly criticized, and that's what we see in the case of the New International Version. I'd love to hear what you think about all of this. Has anything that I've said been surprising or insightful to you? Is there anything that you would like to add to this discussion? Feel free to leave that in the comment section below. Try to keep those comments constructive and helpful to conversation. But thank you so much for taking a look at this topic with me from a Frisch perspective.